All right, everybody. Hello there. I am inspired today by my friend Nafis to dig back into the scriptures um, to, yeah, just gain wisdom and to wrestle with them and to try to find um, guidance for my life. So I was trying to take a break from my work today. And so I went back to Matthew um, and just had some insights here that I thought I would share with you all. So I'm going to share my screen here. And this is Matthew 6. I'm going to go to the version I like to use is the New English Translation. And just because I like the notes on it. So, um, I'm going to read these couple of verses and I'm going to just tell you what I notice about them. Some of the thoughts rattling around in my head. This is Matthew 6, 19 to 24. These are all part of what we have called the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is probably one of his most famous sermons. So here we see it says, "Do not accumulate for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But accumulate for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If then your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is diseased, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." So first of all, I just want to kind of like focus on here, like there's three different kind of chunks, right? This stuff about accumulating treasures in heaven, the eye is the lamp of the body, light and darkness, and masters, God or money as your master. And so we notice the first and the third chunk sort of talk about money in different ways. And this middle chunk seems to be talking about something different, right? The eye, perception, light and darkness. But I want to kind of show how I see that. Actually, I think they're actually playing together to all talk about this one theme of money and desires, and so the and there's this way scripture sometimes where you kind of have this structure of A, B, A, right? There's something that on the bookends, you talk about the same thing, but in the middle, right? That's that's the center core point, and we call that a chiasm. So I'm not sure if that's a chiasm. Sometimes in the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, there's this kind of way that the writers structure it to kind of guide your eye. The outside ideas are meant to center us on the middle idea. Okay. So anyways, that's just a possibility to think of this as a chiasm. But let's dig into this, right? So the first, we'll go through these three chunks and look at them individually. Do not accumulate yourselves treasures on earth, moth and rust destroy them, and thieves break in and steal. But treasures in heaven, where it's invulnerable to thieves and rust. And where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Okay. So first of all, I want to kind of disabuse us of this idea that is saying that, the distinction between like tangible things, right? Treasures that we can, like material possessions that we can touch with our hands that are down here on earth versus like immaterial, kind of spiritual uh, things that we can value that supposedly like you can just imagine like heaven as this sort of sprightly place, angels and like just spiritual values, I guess. And in that sense, it would be trying to advocate the sense of dualism, right? If you've heard that language of dualism, this idea that everything down here on earth is bad, everything up there in the immaterial realm of heaven is good. And all we have to do is take a look at the whole storyline of the scriptures to know that um, the story of Jesus is not about dualism. Jesus is not trying to take us away from the bad earth and to bring us to the good spiritual realm up there, right? The whole story of Jesus' resurrection means, and his body being reconstituted, right, healed, restored, means that that's not what Jesus is trying to do. And so Jesus is the one teaching us here. And so, but I do think he is trying to make this distinction with this imagery, right, of sort of the things like when we start to have this logic of accumulation, right? Um, uh, Grasping onto things, right? Things that are, frankly, they don't last very long, right? Moths destroy, things, our clothes, right? You have to, um, uh, rust destroys metal, right? Things don't last very long. And then no matter how much we do to try to, we can get insurance or whatever, but ultimately there's only so much we can do to protect the possessions that we accumulate, right? That we hold on to, right? We can buy insurance. And this logic of possession and accumulation and sort of holding on to material reality for control, right? Mastery. Um, this logic that kind of turns the good gifts that God gives us in creation, right? The reality of God's creation, that we are meant to have this relationship of stewarding his creation, taking care of it, right? All of creation we inherit, right? Matthew says just a chapter earlier in the Beatitudes, that those who are humble and meek inherit the earth, right? And I think we're meant to even take that literally. If all things are ours, why are we so anxious to accumulate things as if God won't provide for us, right? And so when we accumulate, we have this logic of turning gifts of God into sort of this depersonalized possessions, right? There's this word commodification. We commodify things. And we know how that also changes our relationships, right? Our relationships with people. There's something about the way money can work to change our relationship with people where now we're using them, right? And to the extreme, that becomes like slavery, right? That becomes uh, prostitution and all those kind of things, right? And so the logic of accumulation should be resisted, right? But instead, we should accumulate for ourselves treasures in heaven. And so it is trying to give us this imagery of, down here and up there in heaven thing. Like, so this idea of like, okay, so if it's up in heaven, nothing can touch, right? These corroding forces down here, or these uh, if down here on earth, it tends to be a world where it's a us versus them, a zero-sum game where thieves will come and steal stuff. And so in this zero-sum world, the logic that we tend to move towards is this sort of, buying into that zero-sum game. And so it's more for me and less for you. In the realm of heaven, that really isn't accessible to all these forces, these zero-sum forces, or these corrosive forces of destruction, right? Moths and rust. Heaven is a realm of abundance, right? It's the place where God's will is done, where we relate to each other in mutuality. where we give and receive. And if our treasure, so instead of imagining in this picture, in this verse, like a treasure chest down here versus putting a treasure chest up in heaven, right? I think we should think of it that way. Because, you know, when we think of it that way, we're actually feeding greed still, right? So it's just locating that greedy impulse, that logic of accumulation, to a supposedly immaterial realm. That's not what Jesus is trying to do. He's trying to say your heart needs to be shifted. Your desire needs to be shifted from this way of thinking that's accumulating to shift to the register of heaven, which has this economy of self-giving love, right? And if our treasure, if our desires are reshaped by the desires of heaven, right? If we allow our heart to be located where Jesus' heart is, then we will see our desires reshaped by the logic of heaven. So instead of the logic of accumulation, it becomes a logic of generosity, right? Where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. If we treasure God, if we treasure Jesus, we treasure his ways, the ways of heaven, then we'll see our heart, right, in this place that it can't be drawn into the games of this earth down here in this zero-sum world of dog eat dog. The more I have, the less you have, right? Everybody around us can do that, but we can somehow live in this world with a sacred vision, a sacramental way of being, that we can see God's presence opening up space for generosity, even to our enemies, even to the very people that seek to steal from us, that seek to relate to us in a way that treats us as their enemies, right? That assumes that you're out to just get the better deal of everyone, right? If our heart is located in heaven where Jesus is, then we can relate to all of reality, all of things on earth as a treasure. We can receive everything that God gives us as a gift. And we can stop this logic of constantly accumulating more and more and more. Whether that be possessions, money, friends, knowledge. That's my own temptation, right? My own temptation is to accumulate knowledge. But just this hoarding impulse melts away when our heart is secure in heaven, in Jesus. When we treasure him, the one who gives himself away for us, we start to be transformed, to give ourselves away, okay? So again, verses 19 to 21 is not about, spiritual, sort of ethereal possessions versus material possessions. It's about having our hearts transformed from this logic of accumulation to the logic of self-giving love, okay? And generosity. So now the eye is the lamp of the body. When your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of delight. If your eye is diseased, then your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? And so this is about perception, right? About seeing, about light and darkness. And so there's this interesting imagery of like eyes as lamps, right? So you have almost this picture of light coming out of our eyes, and healthy eyes being able to shine light on the world. And I know some commentators have thought of this as like, actually, that's how they thought that mechanics of the eyes worked at that time. And now obviously we have a very different understanding of the mechanism of how light works and optics and all those things. I don't know if you ever studied that. It's very fascinating. But let's just imagine if that was our way of seeing, right? Light coming out of our eyes, and that's what allows you to see, right? That kind of like the cone of vision being where the light sort of hits the world out here. And then and then we have this picture of the world sort of flooding our body also with light, right? Your whole body will be full of light if your eye is healthy. So it's almost like this two-way street between light goes out there, but also light comes in here, right? It's almost like this um, yeah, gateway into your body, the world and you, right? The gateway to you, to the world, from you to the world, and from the world to you. So a healthy eye, right, allows that transparency between you and the world. You can see what's out there, and the world comes into you, right? You have an accurate picture of reality. But a diseased eye, right? Like you can think of like, I don't know, if you have ever had any eye issues. I know, I think I forget what it's called when you have those spots, right? And then you have to have those taken out. It really clouds your vision, right? And it just gives this picture of your body being full of darkness, right? If, say, your vision gets clouded, and maybe that 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 sort of access point between you and the world is starts to close. You think of, the lamp out onto the world is no longer functioning, so the world is in darkness, but your body is in darkness, right? If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? So you just think of this existential state of being plunged into darkness, bewilderment, this feeling of being at a loss, in a dark place, despair, right? Um, of just almost like, stumbling around in the darkness, looking for light, right? And I don't know if you've ever experienced that before. Um, I remember reading something about a survey recently about how many people in the world are terrified of the dark, adults, right? And there's something about the dark, um, that still terrifies us adults, right? It's the unknown. We don't know what's out there. There's dangers, right? But it's also like darkness. There's a metaphor for so many things, that this sense of, um, also moral disease, right? Moral decay, and also a sense of like not knowing. Um, and so now, what's the connection between this picture? I mean, it seems little of an arbitrary idea that Jesus is talking about the eye and this connection between knowing and seeing and access to reality, the truth, right? To what's really out there in us. And of course, he's probably not just talking about our eyes. I think he's trying to talk about something deeper, right? It's the spiritual sight, this way of our vision of reality, right? Our way of our being connected to what's true and what's real. And so how does this have to do with greed, right? With this logic of accumulation, right? I think that perfect picture is like, when cartoons always show like the dollar signs in your eyes, right? How does this logic of accumulation, this way of seeing the world as a zero-sum game, right? How does that distort our vision? When we look at all of reality through dollar signs, how does that flood the world, with darkness, and ourselves with darkness? So we no longer can actually access reality, right? How does greed sort of give us this tunnel vision? So we only see our goal, which is to make more money, right? Which is the thing we're fixated on, anxiously, whatever, quarterly returns we want in our business, or whatever uh, yeah, end goal we have to produce more, um, to get the next paycheck, or to get the bigger house. Um, there's this tunnel vision that creates in us, right? That cuts out the ability to see the bigger picture of reality, right? But there's also this logic of greed that it's accelerating, right? You never can have enough. Greed is an infinite thing, right? And it's the same thing with the logic of the zero sum game logic, right? the logic of accumulation, more for me, less for you. And we're seeing that right now when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. When you have this picture of the world in this way, it breeds violence, right? There's a constant one-upsmanship, and God forbid that leads to nuclear war, right? That leads to this uh, this way of seeing that uh, cannot see reality as a gift, cannot see a way of relating where we become a gift to others, right? And so when we seek to accumulate, not only is it foolish, not only does it disappoint us because all those things are going to be, waste away anyways, and thieves can break in and steal, no matter how secure we lock our money into these, security boxes or hide them away in banks that supposedly no one can touch, can always be taken away, right? That way of seeing is a diseased way of seeing, right? And it's actually a way that plunges us into darkness. And I think that if you've ever found yourself, and maybe you find yourself there now, having your desires become shaped by greed, by this logic of accumulation, by this way of seeing the world as a zero-sum game. Everything's a competition, right? That's the logic of capitalism, right? You start to see how the end result is you're gonna feel constantly that you're in darkness. You're gonna constantly feel like you're grasping for light, and it's a bewildering place to be, right? You don't feel like you have direction, even if you're at the top of that pyramid, even if you have all that money, you're the successful one. You won't feel like you have enough, but you also feel up there. Everyone says, right, the most wealthy are the ones that are the least happy. But not only that, but you will experience a lack of direction, a lack of light, a lack of knowing, right? You constantly feel insecure. I think that's what it's talking about when it says, when Jesus is trying to connect this way of recognizing that our desires, if they're shaped within this sort of earthly realm, this earthly way of shaping us to have this zero-sum logic, it also starts to shape our perception. That perception becomes more and more clouded and dark, and we can't see truly. Right? We also know this when we watch. It's funny how people are so intrigued by all the TV shows, reality shows that always show the ultra rich and how foolish their lives are, right? How sad, really, how lacking they have, how much lack of foresight and wisdom they have. It's like they don't know how to function and live in a way that is generous towards people. They're so petty. Their lives are plunged into darkness. They can't see how they're being perceived either, right? So greed blinds us. This last bit: no one can serve two masters, for he will either hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So this last metaphor being described here is connecting this idea of money with the metaphor of master and servant, right? And it's connected here is this idea of, again, it's tying together the desires, hate and love, right? Hate and love. I'm going to stop sharing that, and hopefully we remember the language. But how does our picture of reality as a zero-sum game, how does our desire, when we let it continue to breed this infinite desire for more, how does that begin to rule us, right? So that we're not sure that we're actually in charge anymore of our desires. That desire starts to take over, right? And the way it starts is when you decide to serve a master, right? Maybe you feel like you're cutting a deal, right? Let's use a capitalistic logic. Maybe you feel like you're cutting a deal and you think that you're getting a good deal. You think that it's worth whatever you give over for that, what you get in return, right? That's what you always do when you make a deal. But you start to see over time that um, that master, that the person you're doing business with, you are so dependent on them, and you need them to do business with them. Like you're caught into this business relationship with where you can't stop doing business with them, but you hate them at the same time, right? You're super resentful of them, and their way of relating to you feels like they just victimize you. You always feel like you come out of each deal at the short end, getting the short end of the stick, right? And it's trying. So if we start to think this way, Jesus is trying to help us see how greed is a terrible master. We feel like we've caught the good deal when we give into our greed, right? Because we're satisfying our desires, our short-term happiness, by accumulating desires, by giving into our desire for experiential satisfaction, right? And greed, not just for possessions, but whether sexual desire, right? For whatever form of experience, whatever form of accumulation that is not healthy. When we give into that, we think we're cutting a good deal, but over time we actually see like, no, it's sucking the life out of us, right? And we resent it, but we can't get away from it. It starts to feel like slavery, right? And so we have this love-hate relationship. It's almost like Stockholm syndrome, right? With our master. And yet we recognize we have given over ourselves to that. It's in some ways it's still a relationship in which we have willingly given our desire over there, right? So it's very much like addiction, right? And yet we could also, on the other hand, we could also serve God, where God could be our master. And I want to be careful here, because sometimes when we think about God as our master, we can think about that metaphor of master and slave in a way that I think is not healthy, because um, Jesus says in Mark, I think 9:45 says Jesus, he came not to be served, but to serve, right? So what does it mean to be the servant of a master, of God, who's our master, when God serves his servants, right? What does it mean to be devoted to, committed to a master who himself gives himself for his servants, his subjects, right? Say a king and a subject, right? There's a play, there's a like a upside down thing going here. Jesus is playing with the language, right? It's the same way he plays with the language of kingdom. When we think about kingdoms, we think of kings as elevated and their subjects as below. But Jesus is a king who's friends with his subjects, right? He subverts the logic. He's intentionally using the language and trying to fill it with different meaning. So what kind of master? He draws us into commitment to him. Yes, our loyalty is to Jesus and to God alone. But as we become loyal to him, and we see him as the one who gives himself for us and for the good of the world, we actually become transformed to become like God, to become generous. And we find that God gives everything to us. God isn't a master who demands everything from us and makes us resentful over time, right? God, as we give ourselves to him, we find that God gives everything to us. God gives himself to us. He gives his spirit to us, and he gives all of his creation to us, right? We live in his abundant economy. There's nothing he does not withhold from us, right? As Paul expounds in Romans. And so there's this interesting thing interplay when we start to look at these three ideas together, right? Don't accumulate treasure down here. Keep your heart in heaven. Don't be, pulled into this logic of a zero-sum game of commodification, right? The second point about perception and the eyes and how, you know, how it starts to disease our imagination, our way of relating to the world. And then lastly, mastery, mastery, right? And how um, that logic starts to rule over us. So we actually become rewired by our masters, right? And when our reference point is God, we become rewired by God to become generous extensions of God's own generosity into this world, right? So I just love how Jesus is playing with these ideas to show us different angles on the way uh, of the kingdom of God. Are we going to live in this world as if it's a scarce world where we have to anxiously provide for ourselves? No one's out there to provide for us. Are we going to see reality that way? Are we going to serve uh, our greed, and in that way dehumanize ourselves? Or will we learn to live our lives in reference to God, the God of generosity, the God who gives himself to us, who holds nothing back from us, and therefore learn to live in a way that does not anxiously accumulate things, right? That treasures what God treasures, that treasures all of reality and sees all of reality through a sacramental vision, that sees God's presence in all things and learns to see others as beloved images of God, that sees everything that God has created and delights in it, right? Are we going to learn to have eyes that are full of light, that see that in our vision of things, we see the light in all things? That's the vision that Jesus invites us into. That's the vision Jesus wants to show us and help us see. So I hope these reflections are a blessing to you.